Okay, sorry about that. My daughter was visiting. It's one of the hardest things about this is that just outside, took a walk outside with my wife and just wanted to go outside, standing 6 feet away from her and tell her that I loved her and hoped everything was okay. Okay, so I was telling you the Lusitania coming across the Atlantic Ocean, first week in May, on the approach to the British Isles, finding out that there was U-boat activity, but doing nothing in any particular kind of way to try to avoid that. So we get to about 12 noon on the day of May the 7th, 1915. In this area is a U-boat lurking, and the U-boat is designated U-20, so all the U-boats were U-something. This was U-20. The U-boat commander they were periscope depth. He's looking out onto the horizon line, and he spots what he will describe in the log as a four-stacker. So actually I'm going to try to draw this for you guys, just to let you see what's going on. Anyway, so high-profile ship. Here's our ship right here, with kind of a major area here, and then four smokestacks in a row. Get that backwards down there. And of course, the smoke coming in. Hey, divergent wind phenomenon. You guys remember that? Anyway, the smoke is coming. So you guys know that these guys are trained to identify the silhouette of a ship, even in the darkness. So not only did he know what kind of ship, he probably knew exactly what ship this was. It was the largest passenger line in the entire world. It's the Lusitania. So here is the Lusitania crossing across the bow of this U-boat U-20, and the captain decides to put a torpedo in the side of it, okay? So it's right around 12 noon. There were people that were just, especially in the upper class areas, the first and second class passengers, either taking lunch or enjoying kind of, this view. Oh, I do want you guys to know that it was about 6 miles off the coast of Ireland, so they actually were on the approach to Ireland. Hold it up the right way for you guys. This is me trying to, can't really see. Anyway, just about right here, just off the coast of Ireland, in a place called Cobb. I think it was called Queenstown in those days. Anyway, so they're just cruising along off the coast. There were those individuals who were up on deck kind of just watching the scenery. And can you imagine how surreal it would be to watch a torpedo coming into the ship? And indeed, there were eyewitnesses that would ultimately recount this. So the torpedo hit in the first third kind of in the side of the Lusitania. These torpedoes were actually relatively weak, so they're not necessarily going to do huge amounts of damage. It would penetrate, and it may very well have been that the captain just wanted to put a hole in the side of the Lusitania. They're 6 miles off the coast of Ireland. They probably could get close to the shore before they would sink. Just as to let them know that maybe I shouldn't say that. Sometimes these one torpedoes would hit and they destroy a ship. What can I say? In this case, that's actually what's going to happen. But the eyewitnesses who'd have an account of this described sort of a strange situation, that there was one explosion as it hit the ship, the torpedo hit the ship, and then a secondary explosion. So not just one, but two explosions. So with a little bit of a heartbeat in between the two of them. The first explosion was relatively small. That's the torpedo hitting the side. The second torpedo was huge. The second explosion was monumental, big, huge, rocking the entire vessel, of course. And it is believed that what happened with that secondary explosion was that, you had the one little hole caused by the first torpedo, but the second one will rip a hole about the size of a Greyhound bus in the side of the Lusitania. So a massive hole. In fact, the hole is so great that the ship immediately begins to list to one side as the water, of course, begins to come in a huge way. We believe that the captain at least made a little bit of an error here. His notion was that he should try to get, the ship is listing quickly, they're taking on water, but he thought that if he turned the ship, and tried to get it towards the shore, it might enhance the survival situation for the passengers. But by doing this, he drives the ship into the water. So pushing the ship through the water with a huge gaping hole, you're driving the water, and instead of letting the water kind of come in on its own. Now I'm sure you guys have some sense of the Titanic. If you haven't seen the movie, of course, then maybe that's a good thing. It is kind of a long movie that makes you really endure it. But you'll know that the ship, Titanic, took forever to sink. They hit the iceberg, and then there's this long, prolonged situation, of course, where the ship is sinking. I remember when I was watching it for the first time, I really had to go to the bathroom, so I was like, sink, damn it, sink, But there's, so much time that the band keeps playing songs until they can't remember the songs, and there's a love affair and people running all over the ship and all that kind of stuff is going to happen. That is not the story with the Lusitania. The Lusitania was going to sink in less than 18 minutes. So the Lusitania was doomed very rapidly. Not hours to sink, we're talking minutes to sink. And because of that, of course, it's going to create a powerful component of casualty. So as the Lusitania goes down at that time, there were just under 2,000 passengers on board, 2,000 entire in total passengers crew. So we're looking at 1,998 passengers. And of those that were on board that ship, 1,198 will perish. So more than half of those on board the Lusitania are going to perish. I do want you to know that they only recovered ultimately 350 bodies from the Lusitania. So that makes us think that we're looking at about 700 people who never got anywhere near, of course, the surface as far as the ship was concerned. That's the tragedy to me of the lower classes. They had their berths were below the water level, and routinely, of course, you saw that in the movie Titanic too. That there would be obstacles. They're not allowed to kind of go up into the upper class areas, of course. So there were gates and things that would kind of impinge them. So there's just so many the poor people, of course, crossing on Lusitania that become the essential victims of Lusitania. Now, of course, 350 of those were recovered, and these were primarily first and second class citizens. And one of the intriguing things is that they tended to be relatively affluent, and we can see that they recovered their bodies. And I'm sure you guys know what's going to cause the death for these people. They're not going to drown necessarily, but they're going to die from hypothermia. It's just they're in this cold water, and it's extremely difficult for the body to sustain itself. Even into my youth, there were still people that were alive, from survivors of Lusitania. And I remember, I think it was in the 1990s, they were doing some kind of it was a recounting of the Lusitania situation. And this elderly woman who was 7 years old on the Lusitania was just kind of telling her story. And she and her sister had got into the water, and the two of them were floating on a trunk or something like that. And the two of them were holding each other's arms as best they possibly could. But for whatever reason, her sister got hypothermia first, and what happens is you kind of just begin to lose control of your muscle activity, and then you kind of go unconscious, and then you kind of just fall asleep. There's sort of a gentleness to the ending of that entire process. But she recounted how she was trying to hold on to her sister, but her sister was no longer holding, of course, and then she, just because she's getting cold, increasingly couldn't hold on until finally her sister just slipped away. And when she was describing it, she said, "I felt her hand on me for years afterwards." This kind of interesting and morbid suggestion of what was going on. Anyway, all those who were recovered, the 350 that were recovered, the bodies were photographed. So if you have a morbid curiosity, you can see the photographs of them. They were photographed for both identification purposes and ultimately insurance purposes. For whatever reason, the picture that I remember so well is a picture of a mother and her two daughters, and they put them all together in a fairly substantial coffin, and the mother's here and the two daughters are both kind of tucked in under each one of her arms, and almost all of them dressed in very fine clothing because they were the first and second class passengers on this. But anyway, more than half of those who were on board the ship are going to perish, of course, and among those who perished were 128 Americans. So there's a significant American casualty associated with the sinking of the Lusitania. The Americans were horrified, as you can imagine, of course. Woodrow Wilson issued a strong statement of condemnation. The Germans they realized that this was problematic, and the German government apologized to the United States and offered to issue restitution to the families that lost someone in terms of the sinking. Wilson refused this, calling it blood money. But clearly this had a huge impact upon the international situation, especially upon the United States of America. The sinking of Lusitania does not directly lead to America's entry into the war. So we have to understand that it's almost 2 more years before that's going to happen, okay? But I would like to suggest to you the significance of Lusitania. It's the emotional catalyst which turned the Americans increasingly against Germany. The Germans now are seen as the bad guys. They're seen as the foe, essentially. And it is intriguing that when the United States does ultimately enter the war, some of the war propaganda posters that they would show to inspire enlistment were like, women clinging to babies as they're sinking below the waves. So they're trying to convey the sense of the horrors of the Lusitania to inspire Americans, of course, to turn against the Germans. Now, one thing I've totally skipped over here is the question is, what happened to the Lusitania? The initial explosion is understandable, but the secondary one that was so huge, that's the one that people have to kind of come to grips with. It's intriguing to me that when we have two ships involved in two stories. There's the Maine, of course, associated with the Spanish-American War, Lusitania associated with with World War I. And both of them there's a mystery to them. We do not know what happened to the Maine, and the reality is that we don't really know exactly what happened to the Lusitania. Now, the Lusitania sank in a little over 700 feet of water, so it actually would be explored at some point, and ultimately the same guy that discovered the Titanic will go down and photograph every single part of the Lusitania. I was going to share some of that with you, but it's in my office, so I don't have access to it. I have the book on the exploration of Lusitania. All these kind of weird, eerie pictures, of course, of the Hulk underneath the water, and you come up, out of the darkness, you come up onto the railing of the ship and all that kind of stuff, they're very interesting pictures. Now, one problem that we have is that the ship settled on the side where the actual the torpedo hit, so that is out of view. You can't know that. But they've studied the entire situation, and they've come up with what they think is a fairly plausible understanding of what happened to Lusitania. And one thing I find very interesting is that the Lusitania sank, and yet it drifted a mile underwater as it's going. So that the hydrodynamics of an underwater movement of a ship, that seems really interesting. You just think of all the things that are happening there. The ship is going down. Massive amounts of air are being belched out of it in one way or the other, of course. And the hull itself will kind of form an airfoil which will lead the ship to go certain ways. And you make an assumption the ship's going to go straight down. Well, it may or may not. And the Lusitania actually slid. It slid a whole mile from the point of impact to the point where it rests on the sea floor. As it slid, it left a trail of coal, and this becomes a really kind of important clue of what's happening here. So there's coal that is just scattered all along the seafloor in that area, including as you approach up to the Lusitania. So it's led to the speculation, and of course it is to some degree, but this is what happened to Lusitania. The torpedo came into the side of the ship, and then it exploded through that, and then entered into a semi-empty coal bunker. So there were these big areas where they held all the coal. And that semi-empty coal bunker, it became basically a bomb. And it has all the things you need to be a bomb. It has a fuel source that would be not only the coal, but suspended coal dust. This, of course, is a flammable situation. You have an encased area, of course, that's the bunker itself. You have an ignition point, that would be the torpedo coming into the whole thing, and they believe that the torpedo came into the side, into that bunker, and then the bunker just explodes, and that's a much larger explosion, much bigger bomb, of course, than the torpedo itself, ripping the hole, and the huge hole in the side of the Lusitania, and of course, ultimately leading the ship to sink very rapidly, with the deaths, of course, of all these people, including 128 Americans. And the Maine will ultimately become kind of, this real powerful symbol of German atrocity, which will become a driving factor in the American attitudes towards Germany. But remember that it doesn't lead necessarily to war. Now, you go around almost a full year, and there's another passenger ship that sunk in 1916, and that ship was called the Sussex. And in the Sussex, I think there were like a handful of Americans on board, and I think there were some Americans who died. And when the Sussex was sunk, Woodrow Wilson decided that this is too much. So he issued basically an ultimatum to the Germans. Stop sinking passenger ships or else, essentially. And the Germans didn't want to have the Americans as an enemy at that moment. That they're already they've got their hands full with all the things they're having to do. So the Germans issued something called the Sussex Pledge, and the Sussex was the ship that was sunk, and the pledge is the pledge on the part of the Germans. And this pledge basically said that the Germans would rescind unrestricted submarine warfare. They would cease and desist in that particular activity, of course, and just conventional submarine warfare of sinking just, whatever vessel they came upon. And this was enough to at least, placate the Americans and let them think that things were okay. So there's a time there where, there's after the Sussex Pledge where the everything seems to be, sort of back to the status quo before that had all begun. But by January of 1917, the Germans were finding themselves in increasingly difficult circumstances. They did not have the economic support, of course, that the Allies had. The home front was beginning to disintegrate. There was less and less food available for people. They had an extended war situation all the Western Front, but they were also, of course, engaged in Russia, also in the Eastern Front. And the Germans were finding themselves increasingly in a difficult situation, which they thought they needed to find some way to get out of. In the moment of sort of that trial, though, there became a huge opportunity, and the opportunity was based upon the Eastern Front. The Russian Revolution was commencing, the Russian front was collapsing, the Russians were no longer able to offer any significant kind of resistance, And so the Germans saw this as an opportunity. They could take most of their divisions that were on the Eastern Front, bring them to the Western Front, mount a massive offensive against the Western Front, of course, in an all-out effort to kind of end the war quickly and win the war as quickly as they possibly could. And in that moment, they decided to go all in. Their notion was, let's do everything we can in a massive total offensive. So not only an offensive on land, but offensive on sea too. So this called for the reinstitution of unrestricted submarine warfare. Now, they knew that this could probably cause a problem with the Americans, but they were doing a little bit of a gamble. They believed that it would take the Americans 6 months to really become part of the war. And the Germans believed that they could win the war within 6 months. So they took a chance, rolled the dice a little bit here. And we know the Americans might be offended, might want to come into the war, but we'll finish it before they can actually get here. And, and it'll be just a done deal, essentially. So on January the 31st, 1917, the Germans, and in an announcement from the German ambassador to the United States of America, they resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. Now, of course, the Americans saw this very badly. So on February the 3rd, 1917, just a few days later, the United States severed relations with Germany. So I don't know if you guys have heard of this before, but this is when one country decides to cease relations and communications with the other country. You pull back your ambassador, you send their ambassador away, basically, and routinely this is not a precursor for good. This is a precursor for things are getting kind of bad in that moment. So on February 3rd, 1917, the United States severed its relationship with Great Britain. And things began to conspire, essentially, of course, within that moment to increasingly turn the Americans against the Germans. One thing, and forgive me for not writing out a card for this, is the story of the Zimmermann Telegraph. Now, it's intriguing to me, again, I like to do this little comparisons with the Spanish-American War. In the Spanish-American War, there was the Delaune letter, which became sort of this inciting situation. In World War I, there's something called the Zimmermann Telegraph. The Zimmermann was the foreign minister for Germany, and he sent a telegraphic message to Mexico. And the message was basically in anticipation of a conflict with the United States and asking the Mexicans if they would like to ally with Germany against the United States and maybe regain some of their lost territories like California or something like that. Now the Mexicans took one look at that telegraph and they're like, oh my God, they're going to burn that sucker up in a heartbeat, right? Because they don't want any kind of a problem with the United States. But the critical thing was that the British intercepted the telegram. And of course they're like, hallelujah. And they send the telegraph to the United States of America, of course, and now the Americans are really insulted by this. The Germans are proposing a military alliance with Mexico. They're proposing the return of lost lands to Mexico. That's a fairly offensive thing to do. So pushing the Americans a little more towards an attitude of war as far as the Germans are concerned. Then in March, we have the sinking of a number of cargo ships. I think 3 American cargo ships were sunk at that time. And that becomes another kind of push of Americans to be more aggressive. But the big thing that happens at that moment really was the dynamics of the Russian Revolution. One thing that kept Woodrow Wilson from wanting to be involved in the war, remember that Americans generally, of course, are isolationists, was that he wanted nothing to do with the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire, he saw, was an anathema. This is a bad form of government. It's an autocratic rule. There's no way in the world that the Americans would be associated with something like that. But all of a sudden, Russia seemed to be changing. And I must tell you that the Americans and others did not know exactly what was happening in Russia. What happens is the Tsar abdicates, so that means that it looks like they are getting rid of the empire. There appeared to be a new government called the Provisional Republic, and this was headed up by this guy named Alexander Kerensky. And so they looked like it was going to be kind of a Republican form of government. And that was sort of enough for Wilson. He began to think, okay, well, this can be the wars of the good guys, the republics, the constitutional monarchy of Great Britain, the Republic of France, the Republic of Russia, the Republic of the United States of America, against the bad guys, the Empire of Germany, the Empire of Russia, the Empire of Austria-Hungary, the Empire of the Ottoman, okay? So this was enough to convince Woodrow Wilson that, it was time for the Americans, in the most idealistic way you could think of, to become involved in this war. So he goes before Congress on April the 6th, and he asks Congress, again, in the language of idealism, let us make the world safer for democracy. And he asks Congress then to, of course, declare war on the Central Powers. And it's on April the 11th, 1917, that the United States actually does declare war, of course, and the United States will enter. They declared neutrality in the beginning, of course, but the series of events, the trade, the loans, the Lusitania, and then the things that in the immediate moment coming up to the war, all increasingly became a pretext for war as far as Woodrow Wilson was concerned. And the Americans will indeed enter into the war. Now there's kind of two sides. There's the story of American involvement in World War I is a big story, and I feel really bad that I don't tell you much about it. There is the domestic side of that, okay, and I think the most troubling part of it, it's the government expanding its relative power. Remember, we told that's increased interventionism. But there's the kind of negative side of that, there was a real effort to squelch dissent. There's a lot of people who thought this is a bad idea. There was no reason. I mean, and many of them just adhering to their basic notions of isolationism. But there were also socialists and others who kind of came out strongly against the war. And there's a lot of discrimination against these laws that are passed against these people who were simply protesting. If you were a German American, if you showed any sign of protest against the war, you could find yourself in great difficulty, under arrest. So it's a time of suppressing civil liberties in a way that the Americans had never done before. And I think in many ways it's an indication of the Americans were somewhat divided about this war and their involvement as far as the war is concerned. But that's a story. It's a big one. Expansion of government, new areas of activity for women. There's a whole bunch of things that are going on there, but I'm focusing more on the international issues right now. So here come the United States into the war, and I want you at least I want to say something about their involvement in the war. One thing I wanted you to know is that at their moment of their declaration of war, they had the 17th largest army in the world. So the United States was really pretty small in terms of their war-making capacity. Even Serbia had a larger army, larger military than the United States at that time. So the Americans are basically starting from nothing almost, And all of a sudden they have to ramp up for war. I've already told you they've got that problem with their industrial capacity. They've already ceilinged up on that, of course, which they'll push the ceiling up. There's no doubt that they'll be able to do that. But in much of the early training, as they're beginning to enlist this army, of course, to go over, and one thing I should tell you is the Americans were never willing to proclaim themselves an ally of the Allies. They were what they called an associated power. So here are the Allies, and then Americans are associated. So they're still trying to adhere to their kind of notions of isolationism. But as the American army began to train, they didn't even have guns, and so the soldiers are training with like wooden cutouts, this is what you're supposed to do with a gun, bang, bang, and even little wooden machine gun things and wooden cannon, just to figure out all the motions associated with, the deployment of these particular kind of weapons. But it really does show that the Americans were unprepared as they're beginning to enter into this war. And it does actually take them about 6 months to get there. If you do the entire timeline of the time that the United States declares to the end of the war, it's 17 months. But it's really only about 11 months that the Americans are actually involved in it. So it takes them about 6 months to ramp up and get their people over there, of course. But by the time, we've got to that, that 6 months is over, the Americans are beginning to become deeply involved. And we see the Americans beginning to send about 250,000 soldiers per month over to Europe. And by the time we get to 1918, there are over 2 million Americans, boots on the ground basically, and becoming part of this fight. And as you can imagine, this is a huge benefit to the Allies. Whenever I imagine what happens here, it's kind of like you've got two football teams who are playing it to the end of the game, tied, and they're exhausted. And then you bring in a whole new team, basically, that's going to play in the overtime, that are fresh and ready to go. I'm not absolutely sure that would work in football, but you presume that they have at least the physical advantage, of course, if not necessarily the emotional, intellectual advantage. But here come the Americans, of course, into the game. As the Americans come, they're into the war for a short time, but during their period, they suffer the highest casualties of any of the countries in the war. So they don't just come into the war, they start to fight this war. And we had those initial battles at places like Chateau Thierry. I can't remember. These are places where, for instance, the Marines in one of their first significant activities just kept attacking the Germans. And the Germans started to call them devil dogs, because they just kept coming on and coming on. And the Americans really will be a critical part, of course, of the war. And their presence, the fresh blood of the Americans, is the straw that will break the Central Powers' camel's back. This is the beginning of the end of the war, and the Germans begin to reel backward under the onslaught of now the American-led Allies. So it's a big deal, essentially. Anyway, so critical factor: the Americans coming into the war will be the cause of the end of the war, the cause of the winning of the war for the Allies. So the Americans will really position themselves in a very powerful kind of way. Now, the main thing I want to tell you about, though, in terms of World War I and American involvement, is what I'm going to call the peace process. So this was the efforts on the part of Woodrow Wilson to begin to try to affect the post-war world. And he was as I think I told you, he was a PhD, he's a scholar. He's a PhD in history and international relations. And I have to tell you, in this moment, he truly believed that, he was in his element. He had spent his life studying history. He had spent his life studying international politics. And he thought that he could really do something to shape a much better world if he possibly could. So this is the guy, if you feel like this is his moment, to step forward. So he begins to focus his attention in a very pronounced way about, this process to create peace. And he begins to formulate plans and ideas of how he wants to shape the world in the aftermath of the world and the aftermath of the war. And I have to tell you, it's quite an impressive moment, because so much of what Woodrow Wilson was thinking about will actually become a reality. So this is beginning to show us this rise to power. The Americans are going to have a huge effect in the aftermath of World War I. So the first thing he did, and all this is all in 1918. So they declare war. They're getting ready. They're coming over. Then once they begin to see that the movement, the momentum is against the Central Powers in Germany, Woodrow Wilson begins to think more seriously about the peace process. So he's going to give a speech, and we call this speech the Peace Without Victory speech. The Peace Without Victory speech. And that's not the official name of it, but that's the one that kind of that caught on. And it's an interesting and strange construction when you think about it. Okay, so what it means, of course, is peace without victory. So the primary notion was, Wilson believed this, the Americans, was that this was a bad war. And the main thing that you do with a bad war is that you end the bad war, and you get it over as quickly as possible. So peace is of course, the initial intention. But the without victory part is, I think, the interesting part of it. Very idealistic, to say the least. So that means, that there won't be any winners. The war is a bad war. It's bad for everybody. So we need to end this war, and we need to end it in a way, of course, where nobody's winning. But more importantly, I think, no one's losing. It's not the victors who become the problem in the aftermath of a war. It's routinely the losers that are in the more problematic situation. So Wilson's notion is that no one should win this war and no one should lose this war. Extraordinarily idealistic, and in many ways absolutely impractical in terms of the reality of what's going to happen in the aftermath of the war. But this is the kind of thing that Wilson wants to present. In that speech, the Speech Without Victory, or Peace Without Victory speech, he argued for a number of things. Self-determination of people, freedom of the seas, of course, freedom of trade. One thing that he argued that became a really powerful component part of his notion was that there needed to be some kind of an association of nations. All the nations of the world had to come together, in some deliberative body where they could confront the issues of the world and deal with them in some kind of more equitable way. This notion of the Association of Nations, it's an implementation of a concept called collective security, that the nations of the world will be more secure if they come together and communicate with each other than if they stay apart, of course, in their difficult kind of ways. But this idea that he will begin to formulate is the foundation of what will first be called the League of Nations and ultimately emerge as the United Nations. So Wilson's really, tremendously idealistic. This is a democratic body of the nations of the world coming together, of course, to try to solve all the problems of the world. And this is one of the things that he began to promote. Now, he gives the speech, of course, which has general outlines for what he's trying to do, but he follows that up with a more specific policy statement that became known as the 14 points. And the 14 points is a potential identification for you guys. This was Woodrow Wilson's plan for peace in the aftermath of World War I. And one of the reasons I'm going to present this to you is because, and it's just incredibly remarkable, almost everything that Wilson promotes in the 14 points will become the reality in the aftermath of World War I. And so that means an American president or an American nation is beginning to seriously influence the peace process for the world in the aftermath of a global conflict. And that clearly is an indication, of course, of America's rise to world power. Now, the 14 points is an interesting kind of situation for an identification because it is literally 14 points. There were 14 things that Woodrow Wilson was going to present. And I will try to do most of them for you if I possibly can, though it's hard for me to even remember all 14 of them. I would like you to try for the identification, let's say remember 5 of them or so, and there's always a couple of them that I think are one of them at least, it's very important that I want you to remember. So let me go through Wilson's 14 points, this codification of his peace plan for the end of World War I. One of the first things that he asked for were open treaties openly arrived at. And the primary issue here was to make sure that there were no secret treaties and secret agreements made between countries. The idea is that transparency, of course, is safer than this kind of secret stuff that had happened prior to and leading up to World War I. He called for freedom of the seas. He thought that people should be able to travel where they wanted as far as the world was concerned. He called for free trade. There should be an open and free trade with all the various nations of the world. He called for a reduction of armaments to the lowest level practicable. So he realized that there would have to be some level of armaments, and these are weapons, of course, for every single nation. But the whole idea was that if you build up monster armies and you build up monster amounts of weaponry, that probably is going to be an inspiration for warlike activity. And I don't think he's necessarily wrong there, even though you guys all know that the United States of America has more military apparatus than anybody. And we've done it in the notion, of course, of sustaining the peace. It's been a very rough and warlike peace that we've been in charge of, essentially. But I think what he was saying, it does make sense now. So let's reduce the amount of weaponry we have in the world to kind of make things a little safer for everybody. There were a number of the points were what I'm going to call the evacuation points. So places that were occupied by foreign armies should be evacuated. The evacuation of Belgium was a point. The evacuation of Russia was a point. The evacuation of the Balkan area, this would have been Serbia, Montenegro, locations like that. Those became, each one of them, part of the 14 points. There are the autonomy kind of points. So these were allowing people who had been controlled by other countries to begin to be their own countries. So autonomy for the people who lived in Austria-Hungary. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a multinational entity that included Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, and Slovaks, and Slovenes, and a whole bunch of other people, okay? And so the idea was to let each group be their own country, instead of forcing them to be within some kind of imperial situation. So autonomy for the people of Austria-Hungary, autonomy for the people of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire had controlled a lot of different groups, including the people within the Middle East, but primarily focusing on the Balkan area, like Serbians and Bulgarians and other people like that. Each one of them should be able to have their own, do what they want, have their own country. There was a consideration of what they call colonial claims. So if there's a colony around the world, of course, that felt that they should be an independent entity, then those should at least be considered. There was no guarantee that they would be moved upon, but they should be considered. That became one of the 14 points. There was the return of Alsace-Lorraine to France. The Prussians had taken it during the Franco-Prussian War. That would have been in 1871. It's an interesting area. It's part of France, but it has a lot of German-speaking people in that area. And so it had been taken by Germany, basically, and become part of Germany. And now the 14 points were the return of that to France. So that would be part of the 14 points. There was a call for a readjustment of the boundaries of Italy. Italy has these incredible northern boundaries. I swear they just kind of like go up and down. They're like up the ridge, down the valley, up the ridge. And you see the confusion if you ever go there. People south of the border speak German, people north of the border speak Italian, all kinds of confusion, of course. And the idea was that this needed to be rectified in some particular kind of way. Also, there was a point that was for the recreation of Poland. So Poland had been subsumed under the control of primarily Russia, though parts of the Polish people were living under the control of Germany. So Poland would be reestablished, and then in one of the sort of ultimately really important little lines, with access to the sea. And so that access was called the Polish Corridor, and I just mentioned that because that's exactly where the Germans are going to invade as they begin World War II. So the recreation of Poland. And then I don't know if I've done 14 for you guys, maybe one of you are counting, but the 14th point was the creation of an association of nations to be called the League of Nations. So Woodrow Wilson is calling for all of these important kind of developments to create a more just, equitable, and peaceful world. And I think significance, I think, is really clear on this one, that not only is Wilson proclaiming these things, putting them in, but they all became reality. All these things are essentially done as part of the peace plan for the end of the war. So this is a clear indication of the rise of the United States in a position of relative hegemony. And Americans are creating a peace proposal that will shape the aftermath of World War I. So let me finish World War I for you guys really quickly. By October of 1918, Germany was basically collapsing. The Western Front was collapsing, the Americans and the Allies were making advances, the home front was collapsing, people are starving to death. In Berlin, the people would go out into the fields outside of town just to try to grub for some more potatoes that they possibly could. And an intriguing development, I've got a flasher. Okay, you guys, I'm running out of my storage at this particular moment, so I will pick this up as soon as I can, okay?